You are listening to Woodland Walks, a podcast for the Woodland Trust, presented by Adam Shaw. We protect and plant trees for people, for wildlife.
Well, today I'm off to meet a writer, navigator and explorer who has led expeditions in 5 continents and I'm told is the only living person to have both flown solo and sailed single-handedly across the Atlantic. He's known as the natural navigator because he has learnt how to find your way through the natural world, really by looking at the clues that nature provides us. And although he has travelled the world doing some extraordinary adventures, I'm meeting him much closer to home in a forest near Chichester. And that's important because he says actually the globetrotting is in a sense a diversion, and the lessons about the natural world and practical things we can take from that can be found actually so much closer to home. His book, How to Read a Tree, has just come out, which tells you a lot about how to read the natural world around you, and I'll definitely be talking to him about that. Anyway, I'm off to meet him, which is a bit of a joke because I am the world's worst navigator, and my first problem, as ever, is of course, he is not where I think he is. But I've called him, and he's going to come out of the forest and wave, so I'm off to look for a man who's waving.
My name is Tristan Gooley, also known as the Natural Navigator because of my lifelong passion in the wonderful art of natural navigation, finding our way using nature. And I'm going to lead you into my local woods, Eartham Woods, to have a look at some of the clues and signs we can find in trees.
And how did you get into all of this?
Well, I loved, I was pretty restless as a youngster, and I loved putting little journeys together. And then the little journeys became bigger journeys, and through that I developed, it started as a practical thing. I needed to know how to find my way. And then what happened was, as the journeys became bigger and bigger, I had to become a proficient navigator. And there came a point quite a few years ago now where I realised the scale of the journeys wasn't making them more interesting. So I turned everything on its head and learnt to find my way using nature. And it started with very, very small journeys, just, using the sun, the flowers, the trees, and the weather generally as my guide, and just trying to cross a mile or two of English countryside.
I mean, I know you're concentrating on the UK at the moment, but you have done some amazing foreign trips, haven't you, as well?
Yes, and that was my school, if you like, and it was very much a self-imposed thing, as I loved learning about how to shape these journeys. But as I say, it got to the point where I was staring at kit the whole time. I was literally staring at screens, which had robbed all of the fun. I wasn't the sort of fidgety 10-year-old feeling the wind on my face and crossing little lakes or scrambling up hills. I was effectively managing systems, and so that's when I decided to turn it on its head and go for much smaller journeys, but try and understand how nature is making a map and quite often a compass for us.
And that itself surely has its own contradictions, because it seems to me what you're talking about is relearning some lost arts. The very nature of the fact that they are lost arts makes them hard to relearn. So how did you do that?
Yes, it's a really interesting area because we lost our connection with land-based natural navigation in a time when there was no writing. So there are very, very few written records. But the good news is navigation is something, and I feel really passionate about this, it is one of the few fundamental skills. If I'm talking to a group or leading a group, I sometimes say to them, I don't know you, but I'm pretty confident in the last 24 hours you've eaten something, you've drunk something, you've slept and you've navigated. Those are some of the things that all human beings do by and large. And so what we find is with fundamental things, they pop up in stories. So another thing is if you or anyone listening thinks of their favourite story in the world, it can be a blockbuster movie that came out a week ago, or it can be an ancient myth. It really doesn't matter. you'll find navigation features in it. So the clues are there. So I combined that with looking at all sorts of accounts of journeys, combined that with my own observations, and combined it with research into some quite recent botanical research, for example, and piecing all those bits together, that allowed me to rediscover the art.
Do you bemoan the fact that we're now so dependent on sat-navs? We don't use any of those skills and perhaps don't even see the need for them.
No, I see it as a potential win-win, but I think it's about an awareness of how I have this weird thought experiment. I imagine that each day we wake up with 1,000 units of attention, and then it's up to us how we spend them. Now, work might take 600 or 700 of them, and sometimes we have no choice about that. But the question then is, what do we do with the ones left over? There's lots of options there, and understanding the clues and signs in nature is not something I expect to, fill the available units for everyone. But it is something where we can say, well, actually, I'm just gonna give 10 minutes of this day to trying to understand, what that insect is telling me. What is that butterfly telling me about what the weather has just done, for example? Yeah. And then through that, it becomes quite a moreish subject because our brain has evolved to do it.
Yes. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think, wandering through the forest as we are now, it's not a lesson. It's not like, I'll get extra points for knowing this tree is an X tree, but it helps you engage with it. It's quite interesting to go, oh, there's another narrative being told to me that I'm not listening to, I'm not attuned to, but I could tune into that story. Actually makes the walk a richer walk, doesn't it?
Yeah, I really agree with that. And I'm a bit of a poacher turned gamekeeper in the sense that I wasn't one of those kids crawling around with a magnifying glass looking for beetles. Yeah. I discovered it through what started as a fairly pragmatic, practical need through the natural navigation journeys. But what I have discovered since, for myself and others, is that there's a very widespread feeling that we ought to connect with nature, that we should feel something, that if we just go and stand in a wood, that it should somehow magically make us feel something. But actually, our brains have evolved to be doing things and to be understanding things. And if we think about the animal kingdom, which we're obviously part of, we're not the fastest by a long way, we're not the strongest by a long way, we don't have the best senses, but the one thing we do really, really well, our one trump card, is an ability to take in a landscape and understand the patterns and build a more interesting and meaningful picture from what we see than any other creature can. So whether you're talking about a dolphin, a chimpanzee, any creature you want to name, it can probably beat us in some areas, but it can't do what we can do, which is look at a picture or a tree or any organism and derive a more interesting picture and more meaning from it.
So, look, I feel like I'm aimlessly wandering through the wood here. Are we heading off somewhere specific, or we just rambling?
We're going for a bit of a wander. There's no sort of fixed destination, but that again is quite. I think it's quite nice. I often like to go for a walk, and just the sole aim, instead of many years ago, the aim would have been perhaps to cross 30 kilometres of woodland. Yeah. But now the aim is to perhaps notice a clue or a sign that is new to me or that I can share. Yeah. I mean, the view I often take is every single thing we see outdoors is a clue or a sign, and when we take that perspective, instead of sort of thinking, well, maybe there's something interesting out there, and if I'm lucky, I'll spot it. If we just pause, let's pause by this yew tree, for example. Okay. So every single organism, including every single tree, is full of meaning, which is another way of saying nothing is random. And if we just come around the side of this one, I'll be able to show you, hopefully, and this one will be a good one to. So a nice introduction to the idea that nothing is random is that if you ask anybody to draw a tree, you'll get a symmetrical tree. Symmetrical trees, of course, don't exist. When we think about it, we know that. Every single tree appears as a unique individual, and that means that there's a reason for all the asymmetries and the differences we find. I mean, as we look at this one here, we can see it's not symmetrical. There's more tree on the left side as we look at it, pretty pretty clear asymmetry. So noticing that it's not symmetrical on its own is not fascinating, but knowing that we get most of our light from the southern side, and that every tree is harvesting light, and we put those two pieces together, and that tree is clearly showing us that the south is out this way.
Right. Is that true?
It is. Yeah, I'm pretty confident on that one.
I'll tell you what. It's not. We've only just met. It's not that I don't believe you, but I'm just going to. Let me just go get my. Yes, and I can confirm. I can confirm the tree is correct. That is the south. Okay, very good. Okay.
And actually, there are lots and lots of other clues within that individual tree. The angle of the branches, they're closer to vertical on the right northern side and close to horizontal on the left southern side. And this is something I call the tick effect. From this perspective, it's a reverse tick. But again, it's just a reflection of the fact that it is reflecting back to us its little patch of the world. So if you get more light out to that side, on the southern side, the branches are going to grow out towards the southern sky. On the north side, fewer branches, and they're growing up towards the only light they can get up in the sky there.
Very good. So, and that's, I mean, it tells its story, but it's also, if you were lost and needed to go south, you have a ready-made compass.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I was talking about how sometimes we feel we ought to feel something, and actually natural navigation is a sort of fun, simple way of turning it on its head and saying, instead of nature magically sort of plugging me into a different sensation, let me come at this a different way and say, I'm going to ask this tree to make a compass for me, or I'm going to ask this tree to make a map for me, or I'm going to try and discover the story of this tree. What has it been through? And if we wander on, I'll you know, you at any point you want, you can pick any tree you like and sort of say, let's find a story in that, and I will have fun.
It's all right. It's not. I'm not testing you.
No,
I believe you. No, I mean that's amazing. I mean, I know your book is only just coming out April this year, so just hitting the bookshelves. But I've sort of had a sneak peek at some of the elements in it, and I think one of the things I saw quite quickly was about knowing when water is close by. Well, today that's not a problem because water is everywhere, but it might be a problem, and indeed with climate change that might be a very significant thing. Tell me about that. What are the clues from looking at a tree to know that water is close or where water is?
Yes, every tree is reflecting back to us through its niche. So every single organism has a niche. Nature's ultra competitive. There are no organisms that can kind of survive by waking up in the morning and saying, well, I'll just kind of do a bit of everything. So what we find is it doesn't matter whether we're talking about animals or plants, they all have a niche. They all have a habitat that they are better suited to so that they can outcompete other, in this case, trees. So for example, you'll notice if you walk by a river, for example, you'll start to notice willows, perhaps alder trees, and then if you walk up a hill nearby, all the trees will change. Here, although it feels very wet at the moment, we're actually in dry country. We're on chalk here, and the water tends to disappear quite quickly, which is why we see many more beech trees. Beech trees thrive on relatively dry soil, on chalk in particular.
But also, I think you were talking about the leaf structure, and that when you look at a leaf which is near water, it has this sort of white vein in it. But I think that's really, it's a neat trick if I was out with my family to go, I'm looking at this leaf, there is a river nearby, and that's going to get me huge nature points.
Yes.
So explain that.
Yeah, and that's taking a visual cue. In the case of the willow trees, one of the sort of telltales for willows, I mean, willows are a hugely diverse family with tens of thousands of species conceivably, and I don't think we'll ever exactly know how many species, which is why going down to species level isn't super helpful. But a lot of the willows that thrive right next to water have long, relatively thin leaves, and they have a pale rib down the middle. And what I've learned over the years is there's so many clues and signs, and there's so many sort of things that nature's trying to whisper to us, that having the odd visual cue can really help us remember it. So if I, it just wrote that willows are next to water, that's quite an easy thing to sort of forget. But when you think there's what looks like a stream down the middle of the leaf is telling you that you might be near a stream, the brain quite likes that pairing. It makes it more memorable, and that's how a lot of lore, as in folklore, survives, is because it's memorable either in an oral or a visual sense. It's entirely up to us whether we want to do the stepping stone of thinking, well, that white vein and the shape of that leaf is telling me it's a willow tree, and the willow tree is telling me I'm probably near water, or if we just want to skip that. Like, I'm convinced our ancestors quite often, they weren't doing the identification. They just knew, for example, from the sense of a tree's shape or its leaves, that was telling them that there was water nearby, because we still find that in indigenous communities.
Well, you said I should test you at some point. So look, this is a really interesting shaped tree. Tell me a bit about. Well, describe it for us first of all, and then does it tell us a story?
Yes. So one of the first things I'm noticing on here are these thorns here, and we're looking at a blackthorn, and it's giving me two messages quite sort of quickly. The first one is thorns make me look for animals. It's a tiny bit counterintuitive, but because thorns are not the sort of things you want to fly through very quickly, you don't find the fast birds of prey zooming in and out of this, which means that small animals are actually quite comfortable in here. So this is a sort of place where, if for any reason you wanted to get closer to small animals, quite often little birds in there, they've learnt over the years that that's a pretty friendly place to sort of go. You're not going to find a raptor zooming in out of nowhere and making life uncomfortable, because it's just too dangerous to come in here at sort of 50 miles an hour. The other thing is that its size is telling me it's quite likely that we're not in the heart of a mature woodland. So what we find is that there are, generally speaking, there are large trees and small trees. And the reason is because being a medium tree is not a great strategy. The reason for that is that if you grow up to be a medium tree, you've needed all the water and all the minerals and all the energy to get halfway towards loads of light, but you don't get loads of light because the tall trees steal it all. So the reason we mainly have, as we look around here, we can see there are mainly small trees, yes, and then there are tall trees. We've got spruces, and we've got back in that direction, we've got beeches, and an oak there, and then we've got the thorns here, a mixture of blackthorn and hawthorn, and this is the smaller trees are much more common at the edges of woodland or in clearings. If we were trying to find our way out of these woods, you generally go from tall trees to small trees on the way out. So
we'd be near home. We'd go, this is the right way. This is going right.
Yeah,
and that's a fascinating story. But is it? I'm just trying to understand the logic of it. Is that, can you not be put off track by the fact that it's not a mature small tree? It's just a small tree because it hasn't got big yet. So all large trees were small once.
Yes.
So doesn't that rather make it rather confusing?
No, it's a valid point, and I do put that in the book, that there is a look to a mature tree, so you can generally tell when a tree's young, and the bark is quite a good clue. I mean, if we look at this bark on the thorn here, that's quite gnarly, and you can just tell that's not been, that's not a 10-year-old tree, is it? That's something that's seen a few seasons. We're always building a jigsaw here. If a place looks like it's established and there hasn't been much disturbance recently, we're going to find mature species. If you're surrounded by a load of young trees, that's telling you a totally different story. It's telling you that something major has happened. Now, there could have been a landslide, there could have been a fire, there could have been human clearance or something like that. It's pretty rare we're going to look at a single branch of a single tree and say that tells me the whole story. But here we can see the combination of human activity, the size of the tree, that this is a fairly classic, the tree's trying to reclaim the land. So what happens is these pioneer species get in here. I'd expect us to be able to see some birches. Yeah, there are a couple just there. Can you see? Yeah. Just the silvery bark on there. So birches are another pioneer species. So the story here is humans have done their best to clear a track that we're walking along, and the trees, through the pioneer species, are saying, we're going to have that back. If you drop your guard, this land will be ours again. And that's part of the map.
And one of the things I always love about trees is this. Well, we've got lots of little bits of mosses and lichens growing on them. Is there anything that tells us a story? I mean, on that branch, there's a lot more moss on one side of the branch than the other. Is that just because? Is that random, or is there a story there?
When people are new to natural navigation, they often sort of they're familiar with the idea that moss grows on the north side of trees, but moss is really hard to use. It's not one of my top 20 techniques for the simple reason that it's not fussy enough. Moss will grow anywhere there's moisture. So all moss is telling you is that there's a surface that stays moist. The reason we're seeing moss on the side of that tree is nothing to do with aspect. It's nothing to do with north or south. It's because that tree has come off the vertical. But whatever we notice is a key and a way into noticing other things. So if you hadn't noticed that moss, we might not be standing here noticing that tree's come off vertical. So why has it come off vertical? Well, this tree to one side of it is bigger, therefore most likely older, which means this one has had to grow in the shade of it, which was why its trunk's leaning away. Right. So the trunk's leaning away to get more light. That leads to a gradient in the trunk. That means one side is not vertical, so the water is slowing down there and the moss is thriving. I find lichens on trees much more instructive, and the more filamentous, more hair-like they are, the stronger the sign that you're in an area with fresh air.
Yes. They're generally a sign of good air quality, is that
yes.
right?
Yeah. The more lichen species you see, it's a fairly strong sort of correlation.
But these aren't so fine, are they? Or would you?
No. We've got they're not the Usnea family, which is the ones who are most fussy about fresh air. But we have got a good mix here. I mean, I would say it's a very specialist area. But if we had a lichenologist here with their magnifying glass and their way of testing pHs and all sorts of other wonderful things, I wouldn't be surprised if they found dozens just there. Whereas if we were much closer to a town centre, that number would come right down. So here we've got a hawthorn, and as we've sort of seen, one of the smaller trees. But what's rather wonderful is this is very clearly bursting into leaf right now. And one of the most fun things to look for in spring is small means early. And it doesn't actually matter whether it's a slightly taller tree with low branches or a small tree as we've got here. The lower down we look, the earlier spring comes. And it's a simple race, because once the canopy leaves are out and it's sealed out the light, there is no light here. So bluebells will be out here in a few weeks, and they're just trying to beat the canopy. So what we find is that spring at head level comes, typically a couple of weeks before spring higher up in the trees. We've got a slightly different thing which is quite fun here as well, which is we're just seeing a few brown leaves low down on this oak here, and I don't know if you've come across that before, but that's it's an odd word to write and say. It's marcescence is the word, but all it means is that quite a few broadleaf trees, but notably beeches, oaks, hornbeams do it, and a few others, will hold on to a few of their lower leaves all through winter, and then they start to typically lose quite a few of them just before spring. And the fascinating thing is there's no agreement amongst the scientific community about why it happens, which I find, it's such, yes. It is such, when you know to look for it. And it's one of the reasons, for example, beech hedges are very popular, because they hold on to that brown leaf covering all through winter. But it only happens in the low parts of the trees, which when you find things that only happen in the lowest parts of trees, it sometimes has a relationship with animals. And the idea there is that, the grazing animals that could otherwise nibble off the buds, which the tree obviously doesn't want, find the brown leaves from the last season less palatable. And another theory is that if they're shedding them about now, it's a way of adding those nutrients as a fertilizer for the roots when the growing season's about to start. So instead of dropping all the leaves in autumn, when the minerals aren't going to be needed for quite a while, the trees wait until this time of year and then drop some more leaves, like sort of putting feed on the ground, because it's very near the edge of the canopy, the area that's known as the drip line, where water and minerals are taken up. But yeah, I like the fact that there are still mysteries the scientists need to
understand.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're known as the natural navigator. Have you ever been lost terribly? I mean, on your travels, I mean, there's a limit to the amount of danger we're going to get in today, even if we did get lost. But some more wilder places you've been?
I certainly overrated my abilities and underplanned and underprepared when I was a young man. When I was 19, I led a friend up an active volcano in Indonesia and got us horribly lost, and we had to walk for 3 days without food, which was, I mean, I really thought it was the end. I thought that was a mistake too far. I didn't think we'd get out of that, but in the end it was just trying to hold a straight line, and then we saw these trails that we thought were animal trails, and then we noticed they were parallel, and it was the very end of a 4x4 track. It was a pretty harrowing experience.
My goodness. You talk about this, it reminds me, I was doing some filming many years ago with the Suriyai tribe in the Amazon, and we got lost and were abandoned a bit, and initially we did think, oh, this is quite funny because it's a good story, and then you go, we're very close to this being exceptionally serious.
Yes.
And there's this odd sort of emotions of partly going, well, this is all a big adventure and quite interesting. And yet I was also thinking, one more thing goes wrong and we are never getting out of here. And that's a sort of curious sort of tension, isn't there, when those things happen, when you get lost.
It is interesting with when I've met indigenous people and walked with them in remote areas, there's a Western view of being lost, which is quite a binary view. The idea is that we either know exactly where we are or we're 100% lost. Yeah. And the indigenous view of navigating in wild regions is a little bit more what we might almost call sort of fuzzy logic, in the sense that they don't necessarily always know exactly where they are, but they know where they are relative to landscape features, landmarks, and things like rivers and ridgelines. So, and this is one of the things one of the ways I sort of teach people to not feel natural navigation is not about, knowing how to get from A to B absolutely perfectly and efficiently. It's about exploring, taking in signs, and if needs be, keeping things unbelievably simple. So I could sort of show you an example now we could do, which might work quite well with if we pick up the sounds, is if we come off the track just here, just head into a little bit of in amongst the trees here. Now, if we just stop and have a listen. Are you picking up that we're getting slightly more birdsong behind us and the sound of some wind out this way?
Yeah.
It's quite faint. The buzzard in the distance, I think, there. But we could just take a very sort of simple idea, which is that if I held out an Ordnance Survey map and said to you, point to exactly where we are, you might find that exercise quite tricky. But if I said to you, can you find the track we've just been on, you'd look back and you'd find it. But if, having tuned into where the birdsong is coming from, we took a few more steps over there, you can, I'm sure, imagine a situation where you could neither point to exactly where you're on a map, nor see the track, and yet you've picked up just enough awareness to get back to the track, and having found the track, you could then work out how to get home. So if you'd noticed that we'd walked very slightly uphill, then we could start to bring all the pieces together. If we headed into the more mature trees over there, away from the shorter trees, you could have a map in front of you and think, I'm completely lost, I have no idea where I am. But then if you just bring those pieces back from your memory, you say to yourself, well, I think if I head towards the birdsong, there tends to be more birdsong nearer the opening of the track. And I'm going to put the sound of the wind, which is catching the taller canopy trees behind me. And then, I'm starting to lose confidence. But the taller trees have got smaller now, and I know that means I'm getting near the edge, I'm getting near the clearing. Then you found the linear feature, the track, and you just remember you just go downhill from there, and then you start to recognise where you are again. So it's this, as I say, the sort of developed world way of thinking of navigation is you know exactly where you are and you know exactly the right track or path to take to where you want to get to. The more indigenous natural navigation way of thinking of it is absolutely everything is a clue, and if I've tuned into enough of them, you don't have to tune into everything, but if I've tuned into the fact that I'll head towards the birdsong, I'll keep the wind on the top of the canopy behind me, I'll notice how the taller trees become smaller trees just before I hit the linear feature, and I remember from there how to get back. You can see how you're no longer feeling 100% lost, but you, at the same time you couldn't say exactly where you are.
Yeah, no, how interesting. That's amazing. And I mean, we've gone through a very interesting year or two. I mean, there's been chaos and tragedy around COVID. There's been cost of living crises. There's been all sorts of political upheaval. It feels more tumultuous than normal. Has that, you think, changed people's reaction to the natural world, desire to get something from it, desire to engage with it, or am I reading too much into that?
I definitely saw in the lockdowns, I saw what started as a necessary, we were literally forced to find the same short walks interesting because we had no other legal choice. And so what started as a negative requirement, I think, I'm a bit biased, but I think it was sincere. I detected people actually starting to have quite a lot of fun, saying, well, this 10-minute walk that I've done perhaps 100 times before, I'm suddenly realising that there are perhaps 1,000 things I've never noticed. And that I think is philosophically, I sometimes think of it like a pension, in the sense that the earlier any of us start to realise that there is this richness of meaning in everything around us, the more we develop it, and it really is Moorish. The brain loves doing it. It's what we've evolved to do, and so the earlier we start doing it, it sort of nurtures itself, and then you find it's actually quite hard to go on really long walks because there's just too many fun things to notice. I'm an optimist at heart. I'm of the view that if there are positive ways to get people to care about things, we should throw everything at those, because it comes back to the sort of psychologists, as far as I'm aware, have done quite a lot of research in this area, and it doesn't matter what area you look at. If you try and change behaviour purely by alarmism, it doesn't actually have the same effect as if you give the brain a genuine reward for changing. A good example is we can only care about things we see and notice.
Yeah.
And even the word sort of trees can seem very abstract. Whereas if we get to know individual trees and woodland better, then we start to take a real interest in what people are doing to them and around them. That's why I do sort of feel positive, is that our ancestors and indigenous people, you can barely bend a leaf without them sort of noticing, because they've invested in this practical awareness of what things are telling us.
I think Obama called one of his books The Audacity of Hope. I agree. I think hope is often underplayed, the power of hope. And it is audacious, it is bold to go, there is hope. But I think it's also powerful. It's powerful.
Yes, yeah.
Well, I met Tristan at Eartham Wood in West Sussex, which is a fantastic place which I'd highly recommend. But if you want to find any wood near you, do go to the Woodland Trust website, which is woodlandtrust.org.uk/find a wood. Until next time, happy wandering.
Thank you for listening to the Woodland Trust Woodland Walks with Adam Shaw. Join us next month when Adam will be taking another walk in the company of Woodland Trust staff, partners and volunteers. Don't forget to subscribe to the series on iTunes or wherever you're listening to us, and do give us a review and a rating. And why not send us a recording of your favourite woodland walk to be included in a future podcast? Keep it to a maximum of 5 minutes, and please tell us what makes your woodland walk special. Or send us an email with details of your favourite walk and what makes it special to you. Send any audio files to podcast@woodlandtrust.org.uk. We look forward to hearing from you.